we really see this not so much as a presentation, but a kind of introduction to a dialogue about how we integrate social justice principles into both the curriculum and to extracurricular activities. So how these aspects of the Catholic intellectual tradition are already a part of what we do, and how we might challenge ourselves to think of additional ways in which they might be integrated both into, again, curriculum and extracurriculars. I want to begin by saying, first of all, there's a difference between charity and justice. So our focus here is going to be specifically on what is sometimes called the best-kept secret of the Catholic intellectual tradition, namely these basic principles of social justice and how they've been written about and promulgated in the church. So social justice concerns specifically focus on systemic issues as opposed to personal charity, interpersonal interactions where I might be involved in volunteering, or I might be involved in providing some direct support for individuals, whether that's in a soup kitchen or you know, any number of things that we do that are charitable works. Social justice tries to, of course, go to the root causes of injustice in the community. So we're thinking of things that not so much individuals do, but that we come together as a community, sometimes even with a specific global reach. If we're going to really address key issues of justice, they really require that we have global interconnections. So the focus of social justice is not so much taking care of immediate needs, the people who are hungry, people who need to be visited because they're sick, et cetera, but looking at what are the root causes and how do we begin to address those in systemic ways. So that gets us into institutions, into policies, into what our culture is, and that sort of thing. That's our focus today, to look at 9 themes of social justice within the Catholic intellectual tradition. There are, by the way, different ways of listing these, so I do have a handout at the that I'll give you at the end of this that comes from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, and it lists 7 themes. So we're going to sort them out just a little bit differently than they do. We're going to be using a little book by Thomas Massaro called Living Justice, and he does a very good job of introducing each of these themes and helping us see where those themes are embedded in key documents. First of all then, let's talk a little bit about what's the source. Where do these themes come from? Where does this tradition of social justice, where does it come from? And you'll see on your handout here that there are really 4 sources. And the first source is the source of revelation, or the source of Scripture. The revealed writings in the Hebrew and Christian Scriptures that are foundational, of course, for this community, for this college, for the Catholic intellectual tradition. I suppose even within that broad theme of revelation, there are two particular places where social justice is even more at the core. So if you look, for instance, often at these various encyclicals, etc., the two things, if you will, that are most often referred to are the prophets and their vision of social justice in the Hebrew community. This was one of the key reasons for the prophetic voice, was to call people back to justice, call people back to being in right relationship with all of the members of the community. So the prophets in the Hebrew tradition, and the whole idea of the kingdom of God in the Christian tradition, which again is central to the teaching of Jesus. This sense that there is a vision of right relationship. There is a vision of justice. There is a vision in the prayer that we often pray in the Christian tradition, that everyone will have bread every day, and that our debts will not burden us. Jesus often talked about very concrete, specific sorts of aspects of justice. So, one of the sources is the source of revelation. The second source is reason, or natural law. So we have human rationality that gives us the opportunity to make a careful analysis of our relationships, of how we can be more just, what that requires of us in the community, what kinds of policies, what kinds of structures, what kinds of laws we need in order for us to create a just community. We don't need simply to rely on Scripture in order to come to that knowledge. We can rely on our own human understanding and experience in order to identify the challenges of justice. Here's a little way in which Massaro puts this. Our innate desire to preserve our lives suggests the divine prohibition against suicide, and by extension, murder and wanton destruction of wildlife. Our natural desire to live peacefully in society is cited as evidence to support all the rules of social order, to avoid stealing, lying, adultery, that contribute to social stability. So again, we don't need revelation in order to know how to be just. We can go inside and in our own thought processes and understand what those requirements are. Thirdly, there's a long tradition within the Christian community, previous reflection in the church from the very beginning up until the present about justice and what it requires of us. So there has regularly been a community of persons attempting to understand what Jesus' message might mean in terms of living justly. And that tradition, we can pull all kinds of things from that tradition at any one period of time. Again, the importance here is that with every age, there is new challenges. With every development in human culture, there are new ways in which we are called to be a people of justice. Finally, experience, human experience. The encyclicals and teachings of the Catholic Church in terms of social justice come out of social analysis, looking closely at our experience and asking ourselves, how might we live most humanly, most divinely? What does it mean for us to really respect the dignity of all persons? We sometimes, when we think about experience, talk about the pastoral circle. Our experience, reflecting on our experience, theologically analyzing our experience, and that leads us to pastoral planning, to plan for ways in which we might address the root causes of injustice. So those are the four sources that are often referred to as, again, the grounding for the themes that we're going to talk about, and the encyclicals and other teaching documents that, again, are embedded with these themes. Denise.
Thank you. I don't disagree with anything you've said so far.
So far.
So what I'd like to do is start by talking about how I kind of came in the back door to Catholic social thought myself, and how that for me is connected to this conversation that we're having about how do you connect this across the curriculum. Because not everybody's a theologian, not everybody's a philosopher, so how do we integrate this as part of our Catholic Benedictine identity? And then I'm going to talk about the first 4 of the 9 themes. I'm not going to talk about all 9 of them today, so that means you have to leave here wanting more and come back in the spring. That's the plan, at least.
That's it.
So Gary, work on that. So before I did my doctoral studies, I worked as an activist, which if you know me, you've heard me talk about this, and I worked for a national worker justice organization. And if you followed the news at some point, you may have heard that there was some organizing going on with religious employers in both Catholic healthcare and in Catholic institutions of higher education. And if you ever meet someone from a labor union or an organizer, one of the things that you will discover is that they're really good at doing their homework. And so what they did was they went and began reading Catholic social thought. And they came running back and yelling and saying, "The Pope says we have the right to organize." And so our job at the organization I worked for was trying to set up dialogue and partnerships between religious employers and workers to try to address the concerns of both the employers and the employees. And that led me into studying Catholic social thought, and we created a national Catholic social teaching internship where we brought Catholic colleges together in the summer and had students first get a real intense indoctrination, or not indoctrination, but introduction to Catholic social thought. And then we sent them out around the country for 10 weeks to labor religion groups. So they got both the theoretical and the practical part of that, and then came back and reflected on it, and then took it back to their own schools. And so I think it's important to know that came out of, it really began, at least for me, out of a practical concern for justice, out of a practical concern for figuring out how to dialogue and how to talk across differences and different goals and agendas, but also to identify common ground. So what I'm going to do today is just talk about the first 4 themes. And what I would like to do first is read to you, because I didn't list them on here, but if you look on the back page of this handout, what I did put here from Massaro is the major documents of the Catholic social tradition. And one of the things that this list does is really give you a sense of the first 100 years of Catholic social teaching, which began in the late 19th century. But there are other documents that are actually documents from Vatican II. Pope John Paul II wrote 3 documents, one in particular called On Human Work. So this tradition is not limited to these documents here. There are 12 encyclicals or papal writings that are considered to be part of it. but then there are other documents that are brought in. And you could sit and read all of those encyclicals and get a real sense for what was happening historically and contextually, economically, socially, politically around the world. And as people have studied and kind of rediscovered and begun to do sort of archaeological digs on Catholic social thought, and especially in the last 20 and 30 years, they've come to some consensus that there are these themes that show up again and again and again. And as Gary said, the U.S. Catholic Conference identifies 7 of them. I've seen it reduced to a list of 5. There's a list of 10. There could probably be a list of 20, but we decided to go with the list of 9. And so I'd like to start by just going down what those 9 themes are, so you have the overview, and then I'm going to go into the first 4. So the first theme is the dignity of every person and human rights. The second is solidarity, common good, and participation. The third is family life. The fourth is subsidiarity and the proper role of government, and I'm going to go in and talk about what that means because most of us probably don't throw around the word subsidiarity all that often. Then property ownership in modern society, rights and responsibilities. The dignity of work, rights of workers, and support for labor unions. Colonialism and economic development, peace and disarmament, and last but not least, option for the poor and vulnerable. And as Gary said, and I think it's really important to keep in mind, even though this body, this documentary history of text is a little over 100 years old, this really does go back to the Gospels. It really goes back to the Jesus movement and throughout the whole tradition of Christianity. So, and they're pretty straightforward to a certain extent. So what is dignity of every person? What is dignity? Anybody in here besides Richie and me teach dignity, and Al and Drew? Who else teaches dignitas? And Tom? So we talk about dignity around here quite a bit. So Tom, what's dignity?
It's a term that my sections have been wrestling with for 5 years.
Okay. So it's not that easy to define.
It isn't, which makes it, I think, a very good centerpiece.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds kind of easy and kind of obvious. And from a theological sense, when we go back and constantly there's a knitting process that goes here. So that's why Gary started with the sources for doing Catholic social or looking at Catholic social thought. If you go back and look at theological reflection, then we start from the position of what we call the imago Dei, or the belief that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. And from a theological perspective, that's the starting point. That's the fundamental beginning of any conversation that then follows about dignity, human rights, and all of those things that go into gray areas and get debated. The second part of this that I think that's important is, and if you've ever heard of Cardinal Bernardine from Chicago, he's one of the people credited with this language that he named a consistent ethic of life, or a seamless garment. So it's a way of not just taking issues that affect human beings and human dignity and taking them and looking at them out of context, but looking at the entirety of what it means to be human from start to finish, and trying to get to a seamless garment, which I think is a great image, when asking these questions, and keeping in mind the starting point, which is always coming back to the image and likeness of God. Always coming back to that. And what I found when I first started studying Catholic social thought was, this sounds very much like post-Vatican II language in some ways, and it sounds very much like, you know, the 60s, and it sounds kind of like our modern way of talking about people in some fashion, but this language goes really way back. It goes way, way back. The language of rights predates the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So there's an amazing correlation between things that have happened in societies as well as the Church's teaching coming together. The third is equality. And what the Church teachings mean by this and understand by this is that people, and you'll notice that even though we've broken these into themes, these themes overlap again and again and again. And so it's why there's a weaving, and you have to come back. So I'll talk about equality and access and opportunity and voice, but then you're going to see that comes up again when we talk about the role of government. So these themes surface again and again and again and again. Equality in this sense, in the dignity of the human person, is access to political power, social status, and economic resources. And I think those are pretty straightforward in terms of understanding them, and incredibly difficult in terms of making them operational and ensuring that everyone has access to a political voice, has access to a life without discrimination based on a whole host of different forms of social discrimination, and economic resources. And it's this quote, I think, that is from the Church in the Modern World, which is actually from Vatican II, gets at what the Church is talking about with this idea of dignity. There is and this is from John the 23rd, there is a growing awareness of the sublime dignity of human persons who stand above all things and whose rights and duties are universal and inviolable. They ought, therefore, to have ready access to all that is necessary for living a genuinely human life. For example, food, clothing, housing, the right to education, and work. And where I find this body of literature helpful is that we have, for instance, Jay, I think about the service learning programs all the time. And we have a commitment to that at Scholastica and in our different classes and in Dignitas. The question comes is, where are the principles? What are the principles that we build that on so that it becomes a lasting foundation, or it has roots to it, so that it gets passed on and it's not just something school's over, that part of my life is over, but it gets carried forward and it gets integrated. And I think these principles are a helpful way of giving some sort of scaffolding or some kind of structure to putting that together. Number 2, solidarity, common good, and participation. Solidarity is sometimes referred to in the documents as, and Gary talked about this really well, as social charity. And I don't think that if you just take that word at face value, it gets at the depth of the meaning. Solidarity is really going beyond even recognizing that we're interdependent as human beings and as creation, and looking at what kind of commitment, what kind of investment is required of individuals and societies in order to meet the first one, of dignity of every person, to ensure the rights of every person. So there's a kind of method built in here. You also hear a lot the language of common good. We always use I often use the language of common good in secular, not in religious context, in different forms of philosophy. And that actually guides the thinking about social issues that present themselves in various historical periods to the church and to people living in the world. So if we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, what are the issues that are facing people and that are compromising the ability of people to live as fully human and to flourish? How do we make decisions that don't benefit a few, but that benefit the majority? How do we make governments or societies or institutions that don't take all of the power and contain it and make it collective, but actually shares it, shared governance, shared resources? And then participation. And 2 points that, that Massaro makes that I think are helpful is that participation is kind of the and in our understanding of rights. So we have individual rights and we have social duties, we have responsibilities. So there always this tension is trying to be worked out in Catholic social thought. What are the individual rights that all persons have because they're created in the image and likeness of God, because of the dignity they deserve? And what responsibilities, not or, but and, what responsibilities and duties do people have to one another in society to ensure that those things happen? So it's a tension, a balancing tension. One of the things that is discussed is the problem with exclusion, and exclusion from political power, economic power, exclusion because of racism, sexism, lack of access to education, all across the spectrum. That impairs freedom, and it impairs God-given liberty, and it impairs also the ability to exercise one's conscience. And conscience is, again, another inviolable
The decision-making occurs at the level at which the effect will occur.
Exactly. So it comes from the Latin word meaning assistance, and it talks about the cooperation at all levels of society that's necessary. So we can talk about this in terms of local, national, or geographical. So, and this can start from the family and go all the way up to government. So if a decision is being made that affects local people in a local city and doesn't really affect the entire country, then the decision should not be made from outside of that local community. And one of the catchphrases that goes with this that you might have heard is, and I like this, and we could get into a big Republican versus Democratic debate after this, government should be as small as possible and as big as necessary. So there should be this balancing going on, and it should also always be doing this in light of who's making the decisions and who is affected by those decisions. Do the people who are most affected by decisions have a say and have a voice in what's going on, or are those decisions being made without them being at the table and brought in? So it's a call from a whole bunch of different point of views to keep coming back to who is this affecting, who has a voice in this, who has a say in this. And how do we set up governments that ensure that that right to be involved, to speak, to have access is maintained. So it gets very much into the political understanding of governments. And as anybody who's studied history more than I have knows that John Paul II, for instance, and Benedict were both very much influenced by the communism and totalitarianism and collectivism that occurred in their cultural context. And so you see this conversation going on in these texts when they're talking about government. How should government perform? How should individuals perform in their government? So there's constantly this call back to individual rights, dignity of the person, but the person is social by nature. So it's no one is an island to themselves, no one gets to go and make decisions without thinking about how it affects everyone else. So I think it's a hopeful way of thinking about the interdependence and the fact that we depend upon one another, and we can't go off and do this by ourselves. So I'm going to stop talking before I start coughing, and we're going to move into
So let's consider this question. how do we help students understand and practice these principles? How are these principles already embedded within our curriculum and our extracurricular activities? Are there ways in which we might be able to strengthen that integration? Are there ways that you're wondering about or thinking about that that might highlight particular principles? How are we doing? How can we do it better?
The one thing that occurs to me is that a lot of courses I teach, a number of courses in psychology, being aware of a framework like this helps as a starting point. This has happened over the years for many of us with regard to the Benedictine values that the college embraces, in that many of us have found ways of pointing out to students at various points during the courses, either through just our saying something or in our syllabi or in assignments, how the connections are made. And so I see this as a starting point for me personally. Now I have an idea of what I would talk to students about, and I could see where the things would fit in without necessarily changing the course or even adding new unit to it.
Because, again, our study of psychology comes out of our human wisdom, you know, we don't need revelation in order to understand, for instance, if we're doing psychology of the family, the importance of those systems and structures. On the other hand, those aspects of a tradition, like the Catholic intellectual tradition and our Benedictine heritage, can continue to inform and you know, help us highlight aspects.
Or at a very basic minimum, just to translate some of the things that are talked about in various disciplines into the terminology of the Catholic intellectual tradition. I have an example in mind just from yesterday where in our developmental psychology course we're talking about moral development, values, spirituality, and religion. It's a whole chapter and a whole unit. And I vaguely said to the students at the beginning of talking about the moral reasoning section that this might be a tool for them to, or that I suggested that we try to think to translate this into their faith tradition, because I'm sure many of the same issues are there. And I didn't have a framework for doing it, but there was a start there, and now this kind of framework, as I learned more about it, could maybe make me more explicit about this.
Yeah, there was a conference several years ago called Catholic Social Thought Across the Curriculum, held at the University of St. Thomas, and I did a paper with Michael Shook, and that's actually what we did, was we took these internships and then we looked at faith development theory and put those together and tried to see could they go together, and was there a way in which this wasn't just an experience that didn't get integrated, but that actually there was, you could look at where somebody was spiritually or in their process of development, and then retailor even how you talked about or structured talking about these principles, so that it tied to where that person was in their given development.
Oh, yeah.
So I can share that. I can share that paper with you.
Sure, I'd like that, because that fits right in with the way we look at development in order to tie in what we are doing with children, adolescents, or adults with where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say a couple things?
Sure.
May I?
That's what we're here for, to hear all of our voices.
I think it's kind of interesting that subsidiarity. I've never heard that term before. I really like it. But the Latin word that it comes from, subsidium, is almost always used in military terms. It's always the reinforcements that are coming. I think that's just interesting. It's not being used in a military way there. And I also think of the word dignitas, dignity. When I came to this campus, I was just shocked that the first year program would be called dignitas, using the Latin word, because the Latin sense of dignitas is so much different than our translation of it. Not everybody for the Romans had dignitas. Matter of fact, 1% of the population had dignitas, and the rest of you did not, because you had to have autoritas to have dignitas, and vice versa. And it's kind of interesting that I think one thing that may be helpful in framing this for students is kind of the radical notion of what you're dealing with here, is that this idea that dignity can be for everybody is bucking the historical trends of empire, at least. And I think it's an exciting thing to explore and to discuss. But we're still bucking that trend. I'm related to people who think that everybody in this room has no dignity because you're a bunch of poor slobs. I'm far distant related, I'll say.
What's the criteria for being poor slobs?
Just not having as much money as these people have.
Oh, clearly.
Yeah. But I think they would disallow you of everything on this list. And I don't think they're unique in that. And so it is a powerful political force that you're kind of counterweighting here. I think it's wonderful, but the Roman idea of dignity I reject.
So yeah, this is a very egalitarian notion and extremely difficult, of course, as we've experienced throughout our history, to live out, to find the institutions and structures and policies and ways of relating that truly provide or allow the dignity of all persons. So it's a constant challenge. It really is a constant challenge.
It is. Students always tell me, oh, you're talking about utopia. This can never happen. It's utopia. Like saying it's utopia suddenly just disqualifies it from serious discussion. If this is utopia, fine, sign me up.
Yeah, the conversation I'm having in my intro to theology class right now is about the unconventional wisdom of Jesus and how he would say things that weren't simply, be a doormat and lay down and let people walk all over you, but he knew what was going on politically and culturally and would advise them to do things that kind of trumped that system. And my students constantly say, well, okay, yeah, but we don't live in the first century. So we couldn't do that, and no one would expect us to do that the way that he did it, and you don't want us to read the Bible literally, so why are you telling us to pay attention to this?
Well, I'd like to share a little something that I've learned about working with students and getting them to think about that level of social justice. And just really, I want to give credit to Gary because one time he came in, he met with a group of us who were going to Mexico, and he was talking to us about liberation theology. And he talked about it in just the right way so that students could make those steps up and get there. And what I've learned to do since then is to take the analogy of, well, the three steps really that we talk about in social justice: personal, interpersonal, and then social responsibility. And that we all understand what personal responsibility means, taking care of ourselves and not being a disaster. Secondly, that interpersonal level, we're all really good at that. We're real nice to each other. We know how to not be violent, how to be respectful. And so then I asked the question, so as a society, what if we just took those same principles that we take for ourselves individually and take for interaction with other people and look at that as social? Like those same principles of nonviolence and honesty, transparency, respect for others. And what if we hold those same standards up for our social institutions? And then we get the discussion about, well, yeah, it's really kind of the same idea. So how come it's so much harder? We can all agree on what individual people should do for being responsible, individual or interpersonal interactions. We can all pretty much agree on what it means to be responsible there. So why does it get to be so controversial when we talk about it as a political level or a social level? And I think that goes back to Gary's question at the beginning, the big question, why is this the best kept secret? So what's in it that we can't get over this third step of applying this socially?
I have a similar story, and it also has to do with service learning. And when I've gone with groups to Mexico for the last 2 weeks, I talked a lot about liberation theology and along a very similar line. And some of that came from having been in Mexico and listened to the speakers there talk about liberation theology. That's the first time I ever heard of it. I've been Catholic for maybe slightly over 4 years. The interesting thing, I was just reflecting, when I talk about this in Belize, I talk about liberation theology and some of the people involved in liberation theology, but I never talked about Catholicism or being Catholic. And I never considered it part of being Catholic. Now, that's at 50-something, so we're gaining. But we also, then we talked about base Christian communities. And so Christianity came up in the conversation. We did a lot of spiritual things that I would consider spiritually important, and the students loved it. And really opened up and got into those conversations and whatnot. But I don't know how to bring it around to part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I don't know myself how to separate the Catholic intellectual tradition from any other moral intellectual tradition. And I also don't know how to separate what we have here that sounds wonderful from the disasters that have happened in the Catholic Church with the intellectual tradition. So when we say all people are created in the likeness and image of God, and then I think of the church saying, no, you're not, it makes me crazy. So my question back to you is, all of I have many. How is this Catholic, because I don't understand Catholic intellectual tradition well at all, I don't get it. How is Catholic intellectual tradition different from any moral intellectual tradition? And how would you recommend that someone get past the fact that in this intellectual tradition that we're supposed to support in our classes and in our lives and whatnot, that it comes with so much baggage, that there's a real negative aspect. Our tradition does not live our values. So what do you do with that?
So let me take a stab at it, and then you can take a stab at it. I would say, first of all, that there's a great deal of overlap between the Catholic social justice tradition and therefore the Catholic intellectual tradition. I mean, we're talking about this aspect of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And authentic, insightful, rational understandings of morality. So part of this idea that within the Catholic tradition there is a recognition of natural law and the wisdom that can be attained through human rationality. There's the recognition that people who are not immersed in the Catholic intellectual tradition or the Catholic social justice tradition could articulate all of these principles, but without the specific motivational stories, myth, values, rituals. You know, you talked about the students appreciating ritual. Well, the stories, myths, rituals, life example of Jesus and the saints and all of that are a way of moving the tradition forward, a way of seeing the practical implications of the tradition. So I would say that human reason can lead us to these principles, as well as our Catholic tradition can lead us to these principles. The difference is going to be how these principles are celebrated, how they're exemplified, how they're ritualized, if you will, the stories that embody them and give us a background and a motivation to live them out. So that's my response to your first question. My response to your second question about the injustices that are part of the Catholic Church is that these principles are as much a challenge internally as they are externally. So, you know, we have as much of a struggle living out these principles within the church as we do within the world. The church is not in some way it's a human structure. It's you know, partakes of human relationships and the same kinds of struggles that we have living out these principles in governments and labor unions, in colleges, and in particular work environments, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same kinds of challenges we have living them out within the church.
And then we get to the question, why? You don't have to answer that one.
Why what?
Why is it that we have, it's a question that we can't answer. It's an imponderable, maybe it's ponderable, but we have this knowledge, we have our intellect. And why aren't we more civilized? If we got the way to be, why aren't we more civilized in using it? And it comes right back to the same thing, because we're human and all that. But it's a very difficult place to be.
And I guess my response to your question is, three things came to mind. One was, you know, the verse that says, without a vision, the people perish. So in some ways, the recognition of wisdom, and that is part of our human capacity. Catholic social tradition talks about human beings as co-creators. We participate in the development of the world, the development of society, the development of ourselves. So wisdom is wisdom, even if it's not applied. And so what are the different disciplines? I was thinking of psychology, sociology, economics. What are we learning? And really that's where social analysis comes in when we're looking at the sources. Social analysis is a way of coming in there, see, judge, act, but it's also, the seeing means using all the resources to do an appropriate analysis before even interpreting it and deciding what to do. So actually understanding with all of these disciplines, all of these resources, what is happening so that there's an informed action. And I struggle with you. Go ahead. I struggle with you. There's this gap, it seems to me. That's not just the church's gap, it's our gap, a human gap. And I refer to it sometimes as Evel Knievel wanting to ride his motorcycle across the Grand Canyon. And how do we reduce that gap so it actually becomes bridgeable, crossable? And I mean, that's the human condition, right? But the third thing I was thinking was, the thought of sacramentality came to my mind, especially when you're talking about your students. And that ritual, that separation between sacred and profane, between sacred and secular, I think is an artificial division. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, if we talk about this just in the box, you know, of Catholic, that's not an accurate way of talking about it, because it's universal. It's coming and being drawn from all this experience of human beings. And so there's something, and the documents actually use the language of organic, which I like. There's this composting that's going on. And it helps me to remember that there's a lot of composting going on. There's a lot of material that needs to be composted. but what comes from compost? So it's, and then the fourth and final thing I'll say, I don't know if this is helpful. I notice where I'm working with students, they say what your students say, this is utopia. And there's this way in which, I don't know if this is modern Western culture alone, but there's this need for instant gratification and not an understanding of process. And it's, well, if I'm not going to be able to see the results of this, I know working with students in social justice, if I won't see the results of this, then why do it? It's a utilitarian kind of, you know, why am I in this then if I'm not going to see the results? And this structure actually for me gives me a way of answering that and talking to them, because you don't do it because of the results, you do it because it's right. Or you do it because the principle represents some sort of wisdom that you believe and you're willing to continue to do the loaming of the soil that needs to be done, even if you don't ever get to see the plant. There's a Facebook application now called Farmville. Have y'all seen this? So you can have your own farm, and people actually can come over and fertilize your farms for you, and they can send you chickens for your chicken coop and all that. So it's like a virtual farm. And I like it because it goes with this metaphor of what am I doing when I'm teaching? What am I doing? What are you doing when you go to Mexico or Belize with those students? That's a process that's going on that eventually, maybe 10 years from now, they'll understand. And there's a sacramentality about that I think that there's a grace and there's however you name it. There's something more going on there than on the surface.
The thought of it being universal, the universality of it is what I was really looking for, that it is not something different from that. That and that is something that is so common to me, because I can't think of one as better than the other, or one as the only way. I mean, I think of one God. It doesn't matter what you call it, we're all trying to get there. And that's soul journeys of purpose. And so that's what I was saying. Why is the Catholic intellectual tradition different? And I'm happy now it's really not.
I'd like to talk about what I'm doing with a group of senior nursing students. I mean, I wish we were focusing on this too, Lezlie, but Lezlie knows what I'm doing. We've been looking at the college outcomes and how to incorporate some of them. And we're working right now on the heritage outcome. And students have a test tomorrow on, this is just one of several topics, so it'll be interesting to see what they said. But I asked them to reflect on what, if any, impact going to a Benedictine school for 4 years has had on their leadership capability, because it's a leadership course. And then we had Sister Mary Rushford come in and talk about leadership and the rule of St. Benedict, what Benedict said about leadership. And she did just that. She talked about specific aspects of leadership, and she said, how do these relate to what you've been studying? I mean, they're not anything different necessarily, but it just provides a bit of a different framework when we talk about Benedict and what this man said centuries ago, and how some of these themes are of a real high order. I mean, they're at this level. You know, so it's just a different way of framing it for the students. So hopefully they'll see that Benedict isn't different than the other, but it's a very high level. We also see this kind of thing brought into the Code of Ethics for nurses. Their code that all nurses who belong to the profession are supposed to abide by. And one of the things is, excuse me, the right to organize. I mean, it's as simple as that. So we talk about unionism and collective bargaining from the professional level, but then where is it at from a Catholic social teaching perspective? So hopefully the students will see some connections that I'm trying to make for them. We'll see.
I'm concerned that we not lose the, when we talk universality, there are some things that you even talked about that perhaps not uniquely Catholic are part of the tradition that I don't want to lose. And I'm thinking, Denise, what you just ended with in terms of how do you deal with the failure of our projects to achieve their goals? One benefit of this tradition is that it's that. I mean, you've got a whole series of liturgical sacramental traditions, you've got a whole series of what you have here in terms of statements that say it's not a matter of success, it's a matter of doing what's right. And there's a way in which that happens in this kind of backward glancing thinking in Catholicism that you don't get in lots of other places. The willingness to take tradition seriously is simply what I'm trying to say here. The other part of it is, Jay, I was thinking when you were talking about this and in light of your experience, there's a way in which, especially in American culture, I'm going to say as Protestant, but the way Protestantism has affected American Catholicism too, the problem you're describing is a constant problem. How do we move from being concerned with my own, in a sense, moral behavior, our interaction, how do we translate that to the faceless stranger? I mean, this is what gives us in our thinking in this country and in Protestant thought, in the social gospel movement, and especially in political realism, the Nebers. Basically the abandoning of saying, well, love as a principle can work well in the family, for example. It can work well interpersonally. But when it comes to politics, you've got to be realistic. You just dismiss that aspect of love. Well, here we have a tradition that says, time out. That's not the way it is. So just want to make sure that we don't lose those aspects of it that are universal and do come from reason, but seem to be, especially here, in the Catholic tradition, as a strange kind of tradition in our culture. By culture, I mean American culture.
I would say that the love is universality and that it should be in all places, in all thinking and political thinking, as well as any other thinking. I think there's another place that this is important. I'm not thinking of any particular class, but in curriculum right now, in particular, is millennial students. We've talked about how we know how to act with the best intention. And in relationships, we know how to act with the best intention. But with millennial students, they are not necessarily interacting with the best intention because what they're interacting with is electronics. And they're interacting with an interface, with an electronic interface with people. And in a world that's very different, it's very science fiction. You know, you go down this tube of, there's a song about the guy who can be anything he wants on Facebook or some kind of thing. And so I think there's a potential, now this is kind of far out, but there is a potential that people are not learning how to interact morally with each other because of the generation, and it's not because of the generation, but because of the external forces that are present in this generation. And I think that some of what's important in our curriculum is that we create spaces where we have interaction among people without an electronic interface. And it's very interesting that we do that because we are moving so fast to having our classes be online and forcing people into an electronic interface. So.
Can I just respond to that? I can hopefully also respond to what Tom was saying. I think at the last meeting, which I wasn't able to make it to, but I read the flyer.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you made quite a piece.
I thought that would make me happy.
It's nice to know somebody reads the things I write.
What I wanted to say was, so what I wanted to say was about reading, and yes, we're moving on to this this world where there's a lot of different media, and from what it sounds like Tom was talking about was figuring out how we're addressing specifically our readers, when we're teaching our students how to write better, specifically teaching them how to write better so we can enjoy reading more. But yeah, so we're actually holding on to the tradition of writing today, right? When we say, well, we don't want to move our classes online, well, we have to move our classes online. We all know that's why we're doing it. And we also have to move our courses, you know, into a world where people that don't read as much as most of us did becoming the kind of people who sit in rooms like this and talk about things like this. Our students aren't the same kind of readers as perhaps we were or would want them to be. And we need to learn how to capture that tradition, the tradition of reading. And I think the Catholic tradition is that what you pointed out, the religious traditions in general are remarkably well set up for capturing tradition. But we don't want to lose the specificity of that tradition and its strangeness. We talked about dignitas, and you mentioned that the word actually means something perhaps not what we would like it to mean. I had one of my students come in, and I think what they were trying to do is they're trying to write a paper on Augustine for my course, and also fulfill some requirement in their dignitas course. And this was great because they're bringing together these two courses, and it clearly applied. But what they ended up saying in the end, I don't want to make fun of the student too much, but they ended up saying that what Augustine lacked was dignity, because they were simply taking the idea of dignity as we use it today. And Augustine, right, does all these bad things. That's what's remarkable about his text. And then they just simply applied it, right? They lost the specificity of the tradition. And of course, there's no easy steps when you're dealing with big traditions like this, whether it's a tradition of reading or religious traditions. But yeah, focusing on specific things like how do we address the people that are listening to us in our texts when we're writing in papers or when we're making movies. That's a kind of thing you can translate. So I thought that was a good note.
Well, I'm going to keep to the time, and so we are to be done at 5, but there's energy in the room, and I'm really pleased to see that, because that might work well for what Denise and Gary have in mind, which is that we would all gather next semester, and Sister Mary Rushford would like us to do it on February 10th. So we'll just see if we're able to kind of make it happen on that day. I don't know, but there will be an event where this topic will be continuing next semester. And I want to thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.